Asatoma Sadgamaya, Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya, Mrityurma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning.
Good morning.
I was thinking, what a situation it is. I have to introduce someone who has been coming here since before my birth. He has been coming, Mr. Alex Johnson, who is the guest speaker here today. He is associated with this Vedanta society for more than 4 decades, and I am here for 10 months. But owing to the formality, I have to introduce him. Most of you, Alex Johnson does not require an introduction. He is well known. His parents are long-time devotee of the Vedanta societies, and he has been associated with Vedanta Society of Sacramento, Vedanta Society of Hollywood, Vedanta Society of Seattle, and his parents were associated with Vedanta Society of Berkeley, Vedanta Society of San Francisco, Vedanta Society of Sacramento. So Alex had his degree in comparative literature from UC Davis in 1990. Then he moved to Los Angeles and was at various jobs and also pursued his passion for writing. And also he got his master's degree in English in 2005 from California State University. After that he taught in a college English in South Bay Area. And he returned to Sacramento in 2012 and continued writing, editing books. He has an online editing service, and he also had been pursuing a degree in legal assistant. He had this interest in transcendentalism for many years, but it was rekindled in 2010 when the book American Veda by Philip Goldberg was published. He was again interested into transcendentalism, and here he has already given 2 lectures on Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman. Today he will speak on Henry David Thoreau and Vedanta. Incidentally, I am also reading the book now, American Veda, and American Veda says that if Ralph Waldo Emerson is called the mind of America, then Walt Whitman can be called the heart of America, and Henry David Thoreau can be called the soul of America. So, without wasting much time, I would like to request Alex Johnson to please speak on Henry David Thoreau and Vedanta.
Thank you, Swami. Let's see. Is this, can you hear me? Okay. Was it? I'm not hearing it, but I have a monitor here, so. All right. Good to go. Okay. Thank you, Swami Yeshidayananda, so much for that wonderful introduction. And indeed, I have been fortunate, very blessed in. Oh.
It's not working. No. Wait, try with this one.
All right, let's see how this works. Is this any better?
No.
No.
We can hear you just fine.
Okay. I always like to have a little amplification, so I'll try to speak up because my voice isn't really that loud. I'd like to thank the Swami for, if it isn't coming through, I might as well take it off. I'd like to thank the Swami for his wonderful introduction, and indeed, I have been quite fortunate and blessed by my association, my long-term association with the Vedanta Society of Sacramento, with Vedanta Society of Hollywood, and the Vedanta Society of Portland. And this this presentation today is, as the Swami said, is the third of three, about 19th century American writers who were inspired by the principles of Vedanta. And the two previous writers that I spoke about were Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson. And as the Swami pointed out in that wonderful quote from American Veda, when you hear the names Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau is never far behind, because these three are kind of a knit group. This trio was certainly not exhaustive of the period that's known as the American Renaissance in the 19th century, starting in the 20s and 30s, and going up to the end of the century. This was an extremely important time in America in terms of the influence of ideas from the East that came about as a result of the German writers, the Indologists, Sanskrit scholars, among whom the name Max Muller, I'm sure you know, who were working on the essential Vedic texts, and their transmission in translation by other Romantic writers, English Romantic writers, were the main vector of transmitting these ideas to America ultimately. So we have the writer Thomas Carlyle actually gave Ralph Waldo Emerson his copy of the Bhagavad Gita. And all of this was happening, and I think it's interesting to note that all of this was happening more than half a century before Swami Vivekananda's powerhouse appearance in Chicago at the Parliament of Religions on September 11th, 1893. More than half a century before Swami Vivekananda appeared on these shores, these Western yogis were giving us a glimpse of the wisdom of the East, and were living embodiments of Swamiji's statement that every system has produced men and women of the most exalted character. In this period, the 19th century, America was moving rapidly on the commercial and technological fronts. In the realm of technology alone, so many inventions teamed in this period. So many things that we take for granted. This was a time almost parallel to our time in terms of the exponential rise of innovation and in technology and gadgets, from the essentials to the fun were rapidly being created. We were doing things better and faster. We were making machines that made tools that made other machines. This was the period that inaugurated the assembly line. So the innovations that were possible in this age were extraordinary. We were illuminating cities with a light bulb. We were closing distances with the telegraph and the steam locomotive, and we were capturing images with still photography and then motion pictures, and this is only a handful of the vast number of innovations on the technological front. As far as trade, we were opening up new markets overseas. Westward expansion was furthering the idea of manifest destiny, which is the slightly problematic concept that America's place in world history is somehow unique and specially sanctioned, which we as if you look at the news, you'll see we still have this problem with recognizing that there are other peoples in the world that deserve our respect. In the realm of religion, going along with these innovations and expansions, many people were seeking alternatives to the institutions of mainstream Christianity because they failed to satisfy their deepest soul needs. And if you're people on the move who are optimistic and have faith in your own resources, you don't want to hear about a God that isn't involved in your life, in your world, and in your sense of well-being, that you're moving forward, and America was moving forward. So at this time, we had some very, very exuberant and cheerful voices that matched America's sense of itself as progressive, as moving forward, as dynamic, as embracing the new. And we had a plethora of spiritual alternatives as well that were opening up, from spiritualism and the obsession with ghosts and things that go bump to the practices of the Far East. And there were authors, philosophers, and thinkers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, who were associated with the Transcendentalist movement in New England, among others, as well as outliers like the poet Walt Whitman, who was sort of a movement of his own. These thinkers broke with tradition on behalf of humankind. And as a result, their God looked quite a bit different from the one that traditional Christianity had given to us. That God was abstracted from creation. It sort of vacated the premises after creation had been put in place, and wished us luck, but also wished us to fear him because of his judgment. And as the great literary critic Harold Bloom has pointed out in his book, The American Religion, Americans have always had a sense of a special personal connection with God. So what people like Emerson were saying, people associated with the Transcendentalist movement were saying, was very, very much fell on eager listeners at the time, because they brought another kind of good news, another kind of jubilant news. Emerson was a former minister himself, and he broke off with the church for reasons that will become clear a little later or soon. He was to famously scandalize the Harvard Divinity School when he gave an address on July 15th, 1838. to Harvard Divinity School. In this address, he denounced organized religion as a whole and decried the emphasis on the uniqueness of Jesus as an avatar, his personality. He said that his personality wasn't the issue, that we should be looking at actually what he said and what his sayings had in common with the wisdom that was more had a wider scope that many others had said too. He also articulated the idea that every human being is divine, which may be, somewhat familiar to students of Vedanta. They liked this so much that they banned Emerson from speaking at Harvard for 30 years. It was like, okay, thanks a lot, Ralph, but in his essays, he spoke of the relationship between the individual soul and what he called the oversoul, which is his translation of the term Brahman. So he was very much conscious and aware that he was taking these Indian ideas and these Vedanta ideas and putting them into terms that Americans would understand. So the oversoul. His essay called Nature was to become the manifesto of transcendentalism, and it contained such majestic lines as this: standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God. And a contemporary cartoonist had a little fun with Emerson for that image. They depicted him striding along in his frock coat with, he was a transparent eyeball with little legs. So, there was Walt Whitman. I'll get to Thoreau. Walt Whitman was a builder, a carpenter, and newspaper man whose major work, Leaves of Grass, was tremendously inspired by Emerson. And in fact, he said that he was, I'm paraphrasing, he was bubbling and Emerson brought him to a boil. So he had great ideas, and he was also somewhat of a self-promoter. At any rate, when Emerson wrote his essay in 1844, The Poet, he called for a writer who would speak America's own vernacular, had a writer who would not merely imitate European examples, but actually write in America's language. He presented himself thus to Emerson as the writer that Emerson sought. His poetic persona had a kind of a rough man of the crowd quality, as many of you know who've read Whitman. His work is quite canonical. As perhaps somebody who is rude and boisterous, although this persona was largely an invention. In his poem Song of Myself, the jubilant first-person singular goes beyond a limited ego sense of I singing myself to become the I sense of all, man and woman, young and old, free and slave of all races, creeds, and cultures. Whitman's mystic projection of himself, his radical acceptance of life and death and beyond, was what led Swami Vivekananda to describe him as an American sannyasin. And then there is Henry David Thoreau. The scholar Paul Horahan summed up Thoreau's achievements in this way. Thoreau's elevation of conscientious integrity in an age of social conformism, his passionate opposition to the institutional degradation of human life and values, and his enduring literary production as an author, public speaker, and natural scientist, all expressed in a distinctive prose style at once classic and personal, place him at the heart of the era we call the American Renaissance. We're familiar with Thoreau, like Emerson and Whitman, from our reading him in school, encountering him in school as another canonical figure of this period. And from that, that initial encounter, we probably have some immediate associations or images that we've carried away. One image that comes to mind immediately is that of the activist. Here was somebody who stood apart from the majority and argued that laws that violated individual conscience should not be obeyed, whatever the cost. The author of Civil Disobedience advocated direct individual action to protest injustice, which could be achieved when an individual withdrew his allegiance in person and property from the government that supports or permits abuse. This is a philosophy that famously inspired later figures such as Leo Tolstoy, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr., and from there to Nelson Mandela, as well as the leaders of the anti-Nazi resistance in Germany during World War II, who took Thoreau's writing as a sort of a template for their own resistance to the Nazis. He also strongly critiqued American society in his later public addresses, such as slavery in Massachusetts and a plea for Captain John Brown. On a side note, this actual incident that led to the what became civil disobedience was actually pretty comical. He was going into town when he was met by the town constable, Sam Staples, who asked him if he was ready to pay his poll tax this year because he'd avoided paying it for the last 5 years, and it amounted to about $9. Thoreau said that he didn't plan, in fact, to pay his poll tax, and so the constable said, "Well, you know, it's not a big deal. I mean, I can pay the poll tax, you know. It's you know." And Thoreau said, "Well, I'm certainly able to pay the poll tax. I'm just not going to." And the constable said, "Well, then I'm going to have to arrest you." And he said, "I guess you'll have to arrest me." So he went to the jail, and he stayed the night. One of his aunts actually came to pay the poll tax, but by this point the Staples had gone to bed, and so it was difficult for Thoreau to make this first act of civil disobedience be anything but comical. He was asked to leave in the morning, but he refused. It had to be turned out. So, but from those less than glorious beginnings, we have the magnificent words of civil disobedience and the other essays that he wrote, which spoke of the individual's conscience and the necessity of disobeying laws that violate our conscience. The Vedantist Thoreau comes entrain with the naturalist Thoreau. And naturalism, of course, naturalist is the next major image that we have of Thoreau. He wrote about nature certainly in his most famous work, Walden, as well as other works that were published posthumously, Cape Cod, The Maine Woods, and his voluminous journals, which consist of an astonishing density of notations, of observations of wildlife. And his work as a naturalist was foundational to the modern ecology movement. And it's probably never been so relevant. Of course, Thoreau wouldn't have had any notion that our impacting the environment was going to be so extreme. However, contemporary researchers and scientists of climate change have actually looked at his observations from the 1850s. These actually, because he was such a scrupulous note-taker and observer, these provided powerful evidence for the effect of climate change on plants and animals. So without realizing or having any idea that climate change would take place, he was providing evidence that it was taking place. He was also an early advocate of nature conservancy, of the idea that nature was something to be enjoyed and worshipped as opposed to, say, exploited. Each town should have a park, he wrote, or rather a primitive forest of 500 or 1,000 acres where a stick should never be cut for fuel, a common possession forever. For instruction and recreation, he wrote. And finally, yes, when is he going to get to yoga and Vedanta? Finally, we have the yogi. This is worth waiting for whom nature is a lens on the infinite, or a mirror of the soul. As the Thoreau scholar Barbara Stoller Miller suggests, Walden was for Thoreau a spiritual retreat, where he strove to deepen his understanding of his existence, and through this understanding, to gain release from the terrible bondage of life's compelling illusions. In Indian terms, it was the retreat of a yogi who carefully practiced spiritual discipline. So we have these three images now of Thoreau. We have the activist, we have the naturalist, and we have the yogi. So what is it that unites these three Thoreaus and brings them into a single focus? Whatever Thoreau did, his drive was to find the essence, or to drive down to the bottom of things. And he writes in Walden, "Let us settle ourselves and work and wedge our feet downward through the mud and slush of opinion and prejudice and tradition and delusion and appearance, till we come to a hard bottom and rocks in place, which we can call reality, and say, this is, and no mistake." Thoreau found his bedrock reality by using every action and observation as a form of meditation. And we'll see that he was actually able to pierce through natural phenomena, observable phenomena, to see the underlying spiritual reality, just as his friend and mentor Ralph Waldo Emerson was. So when you read Thoreau, you see that he is his observations of nature have this sort of ebullient and jubilant tone, which indicates that it's his spirit rising to the larger spirit, the cosmic spirit. I have, and actually a passage I'm going to read shortly. But this is Thoreau, the scholar of Vedanta, and he was, as Sri Krishna Sarma, who is a Thoreau scholar, suggests, Thoreau was not so much a poet naturalist who took delight in observing nature, but rather someone who wanted to explore the secret regions of life to make life a laboratory where experiments with truth could be conducted. Through nature, he was seeking foundational principles that would resonate in many spheres at once. In the summer of 1840, he discovered the law of Manu in Emerson's library, and it came as a revelation, a sense of being swept over by these words, and that term, or that sense of being overcome by the language of the scriptures is something that he'll return to. He said, it came as a revelation with such a volume of sound as if it had swept unobstructed over the plains of Hindustan. And when my eye rests on yonder birches, or the sun and the water, or the shadows on the trees, it seemed to signify the laws of them all. The insights that Thoreau gleaned from Manu, the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita were to penetrate much of his later writing, because the scriptures met a mind that was prepared to absorb their lessons, just as Emerson had absorbed the lessons, because his mind was vibrating at that frequency, I believe. His works are peppered with appreciations of Hindu thought and literature. He writes, in A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, which was his first book that he wrote during his 2.5 year stay at Walden Pond, that as our domestic fowls are said to have their original in the wild pheasants of India, so our domestic thoughts have their prototypes in the thoughts of her philosophers. During his mature years, he read a great deal of Indian literature, the Dharma Sastra, the Gita, of course, when he was 28 years of age, and the Gita he wrote. The New Testament is remarkable for its pure morality, the best of the Vedic scripture for its pure intellectuality. The reader is nowhere raised into and sustained in a bigger, purer, or rarer region of thought than in the Bhagavad Gita. And he loved the what do you call, the sanity and sublimity of the Gita so much that he used to would sit by the banks of Walden Pond and play the flute like Krishna and entertain the wildlife. He said, in the morning when I bathe my intellect in the stupendous and cosmogonal philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, since whose composition years of the gods have elapsed, and in comparison with which our modern world and its literature seems petty and trivial. And then again, he writes this with the same image that of which he spoke of the law of Manu. When he's talking about the Vedas, he says, "What extracts from the Vedas I have read fall on me like the light of a higher and purer luminary, which describes a loftier course through a purer stratum," which is, he wrote that in 1850. So, of course, he was very, very familiar with, he was absorbed with the Vedic literature, but it didn't simply sit there on an intellectual level as he claimed it did with Emerson. There was a bit of a falling out between the teacher and his student because of that. Thoreau was much more of a person who took these precepts and acted on them. He wrote in a letter to his friend H.G.O. Blake about yoga and its private meaning for him in 1849. He said, "Free in this world as birds in the air, disengaged from these kind of chains, those who practice the yoga gather in Brahma the certain fruits of their works," which is really, really remarkable. I mean, he was able to see the application, the direct application of the Vedic literature to his sojourn at Walden and his intention to front the basics of life, to dig down to the bedrock. He also wrote in the same correspondence to his friend, dependent upon it that, here he sounds a little like Whitman, dependent upon it that, rude and careless as I am, I would fain practice the yoga faithfully. Now he sounds like the Gita. This language is very, very similar. The yogi absorbed in contemplation contributes in his degree to creation. He breathes a divine perfume. He hears wonderful things. Divine forms traverse him without tearing him, and united to the nature which is proper to him, he goes. He acts as animating original matter. And he concludes, to some extent and at rare intervals, even I am a yogi. So I like that he's a little bit self-deprecating and humble. At the same time, he is a genuine practitioner, and he would often sit cross-legged at the doorway of his cabin at Walden Pond from sunrise to noon. And his neighbors thought him a little bit strange for doing this, and that that maybe this was a waste of time. He, on the other hand, in his wonderful rhapsodic language, says, "Sometimes in a summer morning, having taken my accustomed bath, I sat in my sunny doorway from sunrise to noon, wrapped in reverie amidst the pines and hickories and sumacs, while the birds sang or flitted noiseless through the house, until by sun falling in at my west window with the noise of some traveler's wagon on the distant highway, I was reminded of the lapse of time. I grew in these sessions like corn in the night, and they were far better than any of the work of the hands would have been. They were not time subtracted from my life, but so much over and above my usual allowance. I realized what the Orientals meant by contemplation and the forsaking of works." So we've seen these three levels of Thoreau. The activist who has a sense that his destiny, that his spirit, that his soul is united with that of others, and what affects them affects him, to paraphrase Martin Luther King. We had the naturalist who was so in love with what he saw that he was able to capture it precisely, and yet at the same time with this sort of a poetic overtones. And then we have the yogi, and I think these three images are very, very much one. He gave a lecture in 1854 called Slavery in Massachusetts. And there's a quote from this lecture that I think unifies or lines up these three elements, these three areas of his life. He read this lecture on a platform with William Lloyd Garrison and Sojourner Truth and other prominent abolitionists. And I'm not familiar with the other speeches that were given that day, but I'm sure, or pretty confident, that none of them had this kind of imagery and this kind of association. He is able to link up a flower and justice and universal harmony in one beautiful image. He writes, "What confirmation of our hopes is in the fragrance of this flower, white water lily. I shall not so soon despair of the world for it, notwithstanding slavery and the cowardice and want of principle of northern men. It suggests what kind of laws have prevailed the longest and widest, and still prevail, and that the time may come when man's deeds will smell as sweet. If nature can compound this fragrance still annually, I shall believe her still young and full of vigor, her integrity and genius unimpaired, and that there is virtue even in man too, who is fitted to perceive and love it." So I think if we could learn how to perceive the justice in beauty and the fragrance of freedom, not to alliterate too much, that profound linkage between the senses, the world, the thought realm, and the spirit realm, and the sense of common humanity. I mean, I think that is the quintessence of Thoreau. So I'll leave you with one final beautiful passage from the journals, where he's speaking of a sense he would get sometimes in nature, this is sort of an epiphany. In my better hours, I am conscious of the influx of a serene and unquestionable wisdom. What is that other kind of life to which I am thus continually allured, which alone I love? Are our serene moments simply a transient realization of what might be the whole tenor of our lives? To be calm, to be serene, there is the calmness of the lake when there is not a breath of wind. So it is with us. Sometimes we are clarified and calmed healthily, as we have never were before in our lives, not by an opiate, but by some unconscious obedience to the all-just laws, so that we become like a still lake of purest crystal, and without an effort, our depths are realized. And without an effort, our depths are revealed to ourselves. All the world goes by us and is reflected in our deeps. Such clarity,